Welcome, everyone. Today, your host will be Dr. Valera, dear friend of mine.
Oh, well, thank you, Katherine. So today we have three very special guests, and they're going to be talking to you about papers that were published in the special issue of Journal of Head Trauma Rehabilitation. John Corrigan, the editor, is incredible in that he is one of the first people who's actually written a paper on brain injuries in women who've experienced partner violence. And now, many years later, he was supportive of this issue, which Angela Colantonio and I co-edited, and was the first issue of this year in January. So we actually, when we put out the call for the topic, it was kind of crazy because we got so many articles that we couldn't accept everything. I mean, we had just the abstracts. And so we could only invite a certain number of abstracts because otherwise the issue would be way too big. And even then we kind of made it a little bit bigger than would be typical. But the bottom line is it was really, really great to see so many people who actually either had data or had information that they wanted to share on the intersection of intimate partner violence and brain injury. Altaf Saadi is somebody who has honestly kind of amazed me because she came up to me one day and said, "Hey, I'm kind of interested in doing some work in this area, and your work looks like you may have data that I may be able to work with, and can we do something?" And I was like, sure. And she took some data that was painstakingly collected, but we hadn't finished. I mean, I haven't had time to do everything I wanted to with it. And she wrote an amazing paper, and we submitted it to the Journal of Head Trauma Rehab, and it got accepted. And so she's going to tell you a bit about herself, what she's doing, and she's got amazing other work on the side, which will hopefully be funded soon. And so she'll tell us who she is, a little bit about her background, and then a little bit about the paper that was just published. So without my ramblings any longer, I will say, Altaf, please take it away. Thank you.
Thank you, Eve. And I am so grateful to have Eve as a mentor. So I'll tell you a little bit about my background and sort of how I sort of came into this space. So I'm a general neurologist at Mass General, and I also, the other hat that I wear is I'm associate director of the MGH Asylum Clinic. And so in that context, we do a lot of medical and psychological evaluations of people who are going through the asylum process and have fled persecution, often in the context of war, but intimate partner violence is actually a really, really large segment of that. And so I'd been sort of seeing increasingly a lot more brain injury in my work in that space. And so I've been really wanting to explore that more. And so that's how I ended up sort of reaching out to Eve, and was so lucky to have her there and sort of take me on and mentor me through various iterations of a grant proposal and to work on this paper. So really excited to get to share with you this work that sort of, it's not specific to a population that I've done a lot of other work on, but I'm hoping in the future that it can involve sort of focus of immigrant, refugee, and asylum seeker populations to sort of blend the worlds together, because I think there's a lot of overlap. So I sort of wanted to give you guys the two conceptual frameworks that I think informed this, and sort of why I wanted to look at childhood trauma. So there's sort of the life course approach that sort of recognizes that health in early life affects health in later life, and a lot of all adult function, age-related chronic disease, even injury sort of have their origins in common early life experiences and risk factors. And a lot of times this is sort of accumulated over time. There's accumulation of trauma and inequities that build up over the course of someone's life. So I'll just give you an example of so as a neurologist, I see a lot of older adults. We know that people who have older adults that have a lot of falls and sustained head injury are more likely to live in homes that have disrepair or in neighborhoods without sidewalks. But you can imagine that that same risk in older age is also there in someone in younger age, right? So those children's might, in those same circumstances, might be more subject to falls or head injuries because maybe in their home there aren't railings that are up to code or there aren't sidewalks, and so they're more susceptible to motor vehicle collisions versus pedestrian collisions, for example. So I think just sort of thinking of that example and how that risk can accumulate over time. And even though some of our work might focus on old age or midlife, but really acknowledging and recognizing that there is often an accumulation of trauma, and especially inequities, particularly, around race and lower socioeconomic status, that patterns against, because of longstanding histories of racism and segregation in this country sort of pattern together. The other model that I think informs my work and some other projects that I'm not going to be going into today, but I think is important to just mention as the framework are the ACEs, or the adverse childhood experiences. So for people who are not familiar with that, these are traumatic or stressful events that occur in the first 18 years of life, and these are associated with negative physical and mental health consequences later in life. So cardiovascular disease, depression, injuries. And this is a model that's been proposed by the CDC. They sort of acknowledge that these ACEs are born in the context of social conditions and even generational trauma. And then they result in sort of disrupted neurodevelopment, changes in social, emotional, cognitive impairment. And then that sort of leads to differences in different predispositions to disease, which is where we often see people. But it's sort of recognizing that if we are seeing people in this little sliver of the pyramid, right, that there's sort of all of this that has informed that or has gone into that. So I think it's helpful to sort of use these frameworks as I go through the particular study, but other work that I've been doing sort of really use these two frameworks and sort of thinking about risk and health and cumulative trauma. And I should say, in the context of brain injury, there is increasing recognition and studies, although not a lot, around ACEs in the context of brain injury. There was one study of adults that found an association between sort of ACEs and lifetime prevalence of brain injury, nearly like a threefold increase in terms of greater odds of reporting a lifetime history of brain injury. So that literature is sort of developing. And so I was really interested in looking at childhood trauma as well as brain injury on persistent neurobehavioral symptoms. And we know that a subset of patients with brain injury have post-concussion syndrome, right? So these varied symptoms that can be somatic in terms of headaches, dizziness, right? That can be cognitive in terms of memory issues, that can be emotional in terms of depression, anxiety. We refer to these in the paper as neurobehavioral symptoms more broadly, because I think we recognize that these symptoms that make up post-concussion syndrome are actually pretty common in the general population, whether or not they have brain injury, and especially in people, and have been shown to be more prevalent in women and those with chronic health issues and psychiatric issues. So studies have shown that even in the general population without any neurologic or psychological disorders, that people can report these symptoms in about a third to even 2/3 of the population. So just making a point, it's sort of the same umbrella of post-concussion syndrome, and we refer to neurobehavioral symptoms, but thinking that intimate partner violence would be compounding sort of the severity and persistence of these symptoms, maybe because they're contributing to psychological disorders. And including childhood trauma in the picture, we hypothesized that there's a pathway such that childhood trauma contributes to persistent neurobehavioral symptoms among IPV survivors using the cumulative stressor model, and that sort of contribution to psychological disorders would be on that pathway, so that you have childhood trauma that could be contributing to premorbid psychological issues, and that's contributing to neurobehavioral symptoms for those IPV survivors with and without brain injury. So these were the three goals of our paper. So the first was to identify the relationship between childhood trauma and neurobehavioral symptoms in this sample of IPV survivors, and looking specifically at how PTSD symptoms and alexithymia sort of mediated that relationship. The second was to look at the association between IPV-related brain injury severity and neurobehavioral symptoms. And then the third was to look at sort of the subdomains of neurobehavioral symptoms of physical, emotional, and cognitive, and to see if there was a different pattern in terms of which of these subset of symptoms were affected in the context of childhood trauma or IPV-related brain injury. So this sample is 99 women that Eve had recruited from different community sites, served women who had experienced IPV, and they completed sort of various questionnaires and neuropsych measures. And these are the measures that we included in this study. And I won't, for the sake of time, go through these measures, but just, and the paper sort of includes, references and more details about these, but just so that we're all on the same page. The brain injury severity was included using this BISA interview scale. Partner abuse severity was measured. Neurobehavioral symptoms used the Rivermead questionnaire. Childhood trauma, PTSD, which used the clinician administered PTSD scale. Alexithymia, for those of you who may not be familiar with that concept, is essentially difficulty identifying and describing emotions. And that's one aspect of emotional dysregulation that's been shown to be pretty common in people who face trauma. That could be both childhood trauma or IPV, but sort of that exposed to a lot of trauma and have difficulty sort of describing or identifying emotions that you're dealing with. And then the covariates being age and educational attainment, because we know that that's associated with post-concussive neurobehavioral symptoms. And then this is just the description of the samples. It's a pretty young group in their 30s. On average, they had a high school education, mostly white, followed by about a third who were Black. And in terms of brain injury sustained, about 74% had IPV-related brain injury. Most of those were mild, and also the majority had more than one mild TBI, and that 37% of them had strangulation-related brain injury or alteration in consciousness. And there wasn't a significant difference between the post-concussive symptoms reported in the sample that had brain injury and those who didn't. So I think speaking to the fact that the neurobehavioral symptoms are not specific to brain injury, because there wasn't a difference in the total sample versus just the group that had brain injury. And then in our, these are the analysis. So in the unadjusted models, we saw an association between childhood trauma and neurobehavioral symptoms, as well as brain injury and neurobehavioral symptoms. And then these remained significant when we adjusted with these other variables. And then we looked at the different subdomains of the subscales, and we found that the childhood trauma was particularly associated with emotional subscale symptoms and then somatic subscale symptoms. So this for the somatic, thinking again, dizziness, headache, sleep issues. And then IPV-related brain injury was associated more with the somatic symptoms and then the cognitive symptoms in the sample that had the brain injury. And then we did a mediational analysis. So again, remember we talked about, we're thinking about this pathway where we think childhood trauma leads to neurobehavioral symptoms, And a pathway that happens is through contributing to psychological sort of disorders and symptoms. And we found that PTSD partially mediated that relationship, but not alexithymia. So again, to say that childhood trauma may be leading to PTSD symptoms, which is contributing to neurobehavioral symptoms among IPV survivors, regardless of brain injury. So to wrap up, I think these are sort of two major findings. So the first being that childhood trauma severity is associated with higher levels of neurobehavioral symptoms, specifically in the emotional and somatic domains, respective of brain injury, and that we think that this is at least partially mediated by PTSD that increases the risk of neurobehavioral symptoms. And then, for those with brain injury, we know that pre-brain injury mental health status contributes to persistent symptoms after head injury. So thinking that this might be an important part of the history and context to get for IPV survivors. And then in terms of the second, being that greater IPV related brain injury is associated with more somatic and cognitive symptoms independent of childhood trauma. So we may think about maybe tailoring interventions like cognitive rehab for IPV survivors with greater brain injury severity, because that domain is more affected. And together, really thinking about neurobehavioral symptoms is reflective of a complicated history of trauma that includes childhood trauma as well as adulthood trauma. And obviously, there are a lot of study limitations, but I think it's really thinking about how this could inform different screening, for IPV survivors in terms of asking about childhood trauma and incorporating that into our assessments as something that could be contributing to neurobehavioral symptoms across various domains with and without brain injury. And that's it, and look forward to people's thoughts and reflections.
That was awesome. Thank you. I'm looking at the time. I'll take one question. I don't know if Katherine was trying to say something or not.
There's a question in the chat.
Yeah.
Let's do that.
Let's do that one, and then we'll move on, just that we make sure we don't run out of time.
She says, had you controlled for other brain injury, not partner inflicted in the non-brain injury sample? And you picked up on one of the limitations that we did not include other non-partner inflicted. But as we know from sort of other work or other papers, that we do know like ACEs and can contribute to non-partner inflicted brain injury. So I do think that that's something that is a major thing that you're picking up on, Hope. And so I think, it is a limitation and could have definitely, I think,
well,
yeah.
But I will say that we actually made sure that there were no recent moderate to severe brain injuries. I forget exactly where we categorize those.
Nothing in the past year. So we wanted to, we limited it to sort of the most recent.
There was some, but we actually have a little bit more data on that. But yeah, I would want to see exactly which data you used to answer that more definitively. But at least when we looked originally, there was a preponderance of folks who had IPV related TBIs, and there were many fewer non-IPV related TBIs. So, but that's obviously a very good question if we really want to control for that. But I think we probably did a pretty good job, better than, because we did have that into consideration when we were collecting the data. So if somebody else has another question, hopefully we will have a little bit of time at the end. I always like to give more time, but since we have Dr. Daugherty and Dr. Nemeth who are also going to present, let's make sure we do that. And thank you so much, Altaf. That was awesome. And it was a total pleasure working with you on that project. So thank you again. And so next, I think we are going to go with, Dr. Daugherty next. Julia. And I don't know if Katherine, you want to switch over the controls to her? And I'll just say really quickly about Julia. She's assistant professor at the University of Valladolid. I'm not sure. It's a Spanish name, and I've never heard of it, so I might be saying it a little bit wrong. But in research at the Mind, Brain, and Behavior Research Center in Granada, Spain. She has worked with me on and off for a number of years. She approached me sort of out of the blue one day and saying, "Hey, we're working down in here in Spain. Would you like to collaborate with us on these projects?" And I was like, "Sure." And then she came into the research day in my lab, and she is really a wonderful person on top of being a great researcher and advocate in this area. And she's at least trilingual, knows French, Portuguese, Spanish, and English. So I guess that's, I don't know, quadrilingual. But anyway, she is going to talk to you about some work that we've done, and I'll let her say a little bit more about where she is. And she's actually currently in Spain at the moment, so it's a little bit later for her. So thank you for joining us at this late hour, Julia.
Thank you so much.
I'll pass it over.
Thank you. Thank you for that introduction. I'm going to share my screen. Let's see if I share the right one. Are you all able to see my presentation?
Not yet.
Not yet. Okay. Still no. Maybe I'll stop the share and see if I can share it again. Let's see here.
It says that you started screen sharing. It should be there. And you've selected the actual screen that you want.
I did. Okay, I'm going to try one more time. Let's see here. I could also share my desktop and then maybe pull it into the desktop that I shared the PowerPoint. Let's see. Let's see if I disconnect it from here.
It's definitely saying Julia has started screen sharing, double click to enter full screen mode.
Okay, but it's just not showing up there. Maybe I'll try sharing my whole desktop so you all can see how messy my desktop is. Let's see here.
This is a judgment-free zone.
Yes. How about now?
Yep.
Okay, we see it now.
Okay, how about the presentation?
There you go.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Perfect.
Great. Well, thank you for the introduction. I have been so lucky to have Eve as a mentor over the years. As she said, I did a pre-doctoral stay in her lab a few years back now. So that's when I started working on some of this data, which is her data from, I think, her doctoral thesis. And we specifically wanted to see if there was any effect of strangulation or relation between strangulation and cognitive functioning and psychological outcomes. But we also collaborated on some other projects. So yeah, I've been really lucky to work with her over the years. And today I'm going to present some data that was recently published in the Journal of Head Trauma Rehabilitation. This data is a subset of data that we assessed from a previous publication by Dr. Valera and Dr. Berenbaum. Many of you have probably read that study about traumatic brain injury and cognitive and psychological correlates to TBI. But today what we're going to focus on is acquired brain injury that is more so focused on strangulation-related alterations in consciousness. This study, of course, Dr. Valera is the principal investigator, so I hope to do justice to the study as I know she would do. So here is just a brief outline of how I'm going to pass through the different parts of the paper. First, just a brief introduction on strangulation in the context of intimate partner violence, the objectives, both general and specific for the study, the methodology that was used, our findings and conclusions and implications. So just some general information about strangulation. It is a sustained impairment of air or blood flow through the neck as a result of external pressure. We know that it can restrict blood flow via the jugular vein from leaving the brain, or it can restrict blood flow to the brain via the carotid arteries. and also airflow through the trachea. And consequently, this can result in acquired brain injury via at least two mechanisms, one of which would be hypoxic ischemic brain injury, which would be a lack of oxygen or nutrients to the brain cells via compression of the carotids or the trachea. The second of the two potential mechanisms for acquired brain injury related to strangulation would be increased intracranial pressure. So this would be when venous blood is not able to drain through the compression due to compression in the jugular veins. As far as strangulation in the context of IPV, we know that the rates are very high. Among studies that have been done in domestic violence shelters and emergency rooms, they found between 57 and 68%. In a previous publication by Dr. Valera, among women who had suffered physical intimate partner violence, they found 27% of women had sustained at least one strangulation-related alterations in consciousness. In a moment, I'm going to explain what that means. And 12% had sustained repetitive strangulation-related alterations in consciousness. So we know that alterations in consciousness, which can be the result of strangulation or traumatic brain injury, from this study, specifically strangulation, but in previous studies, we know that alterations in consciousness resulting from traumatic brain injury, which is measured by the severity of the traumatic brain injury, the recency, as well as the number of traumatic brain injuries, that there's a response dosis, which means that the more traumatic brain injury, the lower cognitive functioning. However, this has not been seen in the case of strangulation, which could be resulting in acquired brain injuries, teasing apart the differences between traumatic brain injury caused by hits. We also know that alterations in consciousness could be a really important red flag for some dangerous outcomes in strangulation, considering that strangulation, a lot of the cases, it goes unnoticed because there are no physical markers. It's really important to take into consideration potential alterations in consciousness. So I've done enough talking about alterations in consciousness. So I'm going to explain what I'm talking about here. It refers to hypoxic or ischemic insults to the brain that could be considered an acquired brain injury. Dr. Valera developed a measure, which is the BISA. I think Dr. Saadi was referring to that measure before. And that measure assesses different items or different factors that are related to alterations in consciousness that could result from a violent act by one's partner. So I'm going to give some example of some items from that measure. For example, one item asks, after anything your partner has ever done to you, have you ever lost consciousness or blacked out? Another would be, have you ever felt dizzy due to anything your partner has ever done to you? Have you ever had problems remembering things that happened just before or just after the event? Have you ever seen stars or spots in relation to that violent event? Felt stunned, really disoriented, or had the sense of not knowing where you were, even what time it was? Those are all examples of alterations in consciousness, and alterations in consciousness are AICs that could be related to not only traumatic brain injury from hits to the head, but also strangulation. So the objective for the present study in general was to carry out a secondary analysis. So if you remember, this data comes from a larger study where Dr. Valera and Dr. Berenbaum had previously assessed the correlates of traumatic brain injury to cognitive and psychological outcomes. Here, we specifically wanted to focus on strangulation-related alterations in consciousness and how that might be related to cognitive and psychological outcomes while controlling for the potential impact of traumatic brain injury. Specifically, we want to assess the relationship between strangulation and cognitive functioning. And in cognitive functioning, I'm referring to the domains of learning, long-term and working memory, visuomotor speed, cognitive flexibility, and nonverbal cognitive fluency. And in terms of psychological distress, we want to assess the relationship between strangulation and general distress, anxiety, arousal, anhedonic depression, worry, and PTSD symptomology. And just to reiterate, we wanted to assess that relationship while controlling for TBI, among other potential confounding variables that I'll mention in a moment. This is important to study because there have been no previous studies on the cognitive correlates of strangulation in the IPV context. Furthermore, we know that cognitive functioning is related to psychopathology such as depression, PTSD, childhood abuse, as Dr. Saadi was speaking to before, as well as IPV-related TBI, as has been found in Dr. Valera's first study. So we wanted to control for these variables since we know that they are also related to cognitive functioning. Furthermore, we also went to control for childhood abuse and IPV-related TBI, as we know that those variables are also related to psychological distress. And here we just wanted to specifically study the association or potential association between strangulation and these cognitive and psychological variables. So moving on to the methods. Women who were between the ages of 18 and 55 who had experienced at least one instance of physical partner violence were recruited. There was a long laundry list of exclusion criteria that were included so that we could take into account variables that could potentially mask the effects of strangulation-related AIC or alterations in consciousness on cognition or mental health. So to just give you an example of some of those variables that we controlled for or that we excluded, it would be bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, severe traumatic brain injury due to accidents, or even severe to moderate traumatic brain injury due to the IPV context or substance or alcohol dependence, in addition to many other variables. After that, we ended up with 52 women for the analyses, which were divided into two groups. So we wanted to compare a strangulation group of women who had endorsed at least one strangulation-related AIC to a group of women, or the control group, who did not report any strangulations by their partners. As far as measures go, we used the BISA, which Dr. Saadi also mentioned before, Dr. Valera's measure for AICs in the context of IPV, abuse severity using the conflict tactics questionnaire. As far as cognitive functioning, these are the domains that I mentioned before. So for learning and long-term memory, we use the California Verbal Learning Test, cognitive flexibility and visual motor speed, the trail making test. For working memory, the digit span, and nonverbal cognitive fluency, the rough figure test. So if you want more information on this, this is in the study, or we can give you a better description later on. Psychological distress, we use these domains, so general distress, anxiety, arousal, and anhedonic depression. We use the MASC. For worry, we use the Penn State Worry Questionnaire and the clinician-administered PTSD scale for PTSD. As far as results, we found that 29% of women in the sample had reported at least one strangulation-related AIC. In terms of cognitive functioning, we wanted to see if there were differences between the groups, and we found that women in the strangulation group performed more poorly on the long-term memory test, and they also showed a trend, so it wasn't statistically significant, but we found a trend for poorer performance on working memory. In terms of psychological distress, we found that women in the strangulation group had higher ratings of anhedonic depression and PTSD symptomology. Now, these two findings that I've just given to you now, the cognitive functioning as well as the psychological distress, we didn't control for some of the confounding variables, whereas here we redid analyses controlling for a range of potential confounds such as traumatic brain injury, and in the case of cognitive functioning, we controlled for example, depression, PTSD, and childhood trauma. And we found that there were still differences in the domains of long-term memory and PTSD symptomology, whereas the effect for anhedonic depression reduced to a trend. So it was no longer statistically significant, but there seemed to be a relationship there between anhedonic depression and strangulation. Furthermore, we found that women who had been strangled performed significantly more poorly on working memory than women who had not been strangled. So what are the conclusions and implications of these findings? Just to reiterate, we found that there is a high prevalence of alterations in consciousness caused by strangulation in the IPV context, 29%, so about 30% almost. Women who had experienced strangulation-related AICs performed more poorly on tasks of long-term memory, and they also reported higher levels of depression and PTSD symptomology. When we finally controlled for the confounding variables, we found that there were also differences in working memory. What are the implications of these findings? So previously, there had not been studies published on neuropsychological functioning related to strangulation. There had been maybe subjective self-reports of memory loss associated with strangulation in the IPV context. And there have also been reviews of hypoxic ischemic brain injuries and related cognitive difficulties associated with that type of brain injury. However, these studies found that in addition to what we found, which was memory disturbances, that attention, speed processing, and executive functioning might also be impacted. So we're not sure if those types of alterations or associations are more so related to hypoxic ischemic brain injuries, or if it's that we need maybe a bigger sample to assess these variables again. This has, of course, some really important implications for clinical settings where women might be getting therapy or rehabilitation and they're asked to remember certain tasks as homework. So, if they're having difficulties with memory, that could have implications on them actually being able to carry out those tasks. And of course, in forensic settings, when we're evaluating women's testimonies and we're asking them to remember specific details about the violent event, but we're also seeing that they're potentially suffering sequela, specifically in memory, maybe we need to reevaluate the way that we're assessing their testimony and the validity of their testimony and support them and showing that, maybe they're suffering these kinds of sequela as a result of IPV. And that could be affecting, the types of resources they get as a result. So in addition, we have findings of higher levels of anhedonic depression and PTSD symptomology, which are also consistent in the literature. Other studies have found that with respect to psychological outcomes, depression and PTSD as well as anxiety are, associated with strangulation. Here we didn't find anxiety. So it's possible that strangulation more generally, not specifically strangulation with AICs, could be related to anxiety. So that's something that would be interesting to look at later. We also, the effect that we found for depression dropped to a trend. If you remember when we controlled for the confounding variables, and among those confounding variables, we had controlled for childhood trauma. So as Dr. Saadi mentioned in her talk, I keep referring to her presentation, which was so well done, talking about the effects of childhood trauma and adversities on cognitive functioning. We know that childhood trauma can affect a lot of neurobehavioral factors in the long term. And so potentially here we're seeing, the complex relationship between childhood trauma and IPV on cognitive functioning. So just to mention a few limitations, the sample size was fairly small. There were just 52 women included after we had taken into account all of the exclusion criteria. And we also could not include more measures for specific types of abuse. So we don't know how those variables could also be influencing the impact on cognitive functioning related to strangulation. So those would be the conclusions and implications. These are some of the references, but you can see all of the references in the study. And just wanted to thank you one more time for inviting me to share with you some of the findings from this study.
That was wonderful, Julia. Thank you so much. You did an awesome job. And usually I wanted to give at least one opportunity for a question, but I don't want to run out of time on Julianna. So that was awesome. See my comment, but that was extremely well done. I'm so proud. So next we have Julianna Nemeth, and hopefully she's ready and can start to set up her slides while I just say 2 words about her. Julianna is also a wonderful colleague and friend. I'm so blessed to work with such amazing people. Honestly, it's really, really, truly awesome. She's a she's good to go. She got her stuff right up. Too fast for me. She's assistant professor at the Ohio State University College of Public Health, the founding director of the Center on Partner-Inflicted Brain Injury at the Ohio Domestic Violence Network, and is the founder of the Ohio Alliance to End Sexual Violence. She does absolutely amazing work working with another one of my super good friends. And I don't want to take up any more of her time, but she's going to tell you about her care advocacy tools that they have created. So Dr. Nemeth, Julianna, take it away. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me today. And I feel like this is an amazing group of people that I'm presenting among. So I really am appreciative of being here today to share what we're doing here in Ohio. So just a little bit of background on me. Although I am an assistant professor now, I do come from direct advocacy work in both the domestic violence and sexual violence fields. So when I speak to you about the work that we're doing here, it really is informed by being on the ground in community health and court-based settings and advocacy for over 10 years. So I was really motivated to come back to school and learn the tools of intervention science, really to reduce health disparities that survivors of gender-based violence experience. And this project really speaks to the power of partnerships between universities and scientists and local organizations that are working with survivors. So I really encourage you to make those partnerships if you haven't already. So in 2016, the Ohio Domestic Violence Network received this federal grant from the Office for Victims of Crime to develop basically an intervention to make local programs more accessible to survivors that were coming into services with mental health and brain injury issues. And so we went through a health program planning process, which they had already identified the health concerns, but we went through a program planning process to help conduct a needs assessment to figure out how to design the program and then to implement the program and evaluate the program. And so I took them through this process. We took that process through an IRB. So everything we did was overseen by an IRB. So that needs assessment, we learned that the staff were not recognizing brain injury at all. And we learned from survivors that participated that most of them had had exposures to blunt force head trauma as well as to strangulation. And that at the time we didn't know to ask about altered consciousness. After we did this needs assessment is when we reached out to Dr. Valera and started to learn how to ask about altered consciousness when we talked to survivors. But we were very concerned at this point that there was this discrepancy between what our staff at agencies knew and what the lived experience of survivors was. So we designed this intervention called CARE, really listening to the needs of the staff and the survivors in the program design. And one of the things that they told us is that they really needed tools. CARE itself actually came from what advocates told us they were doing well in services with survivors already. And that was to connect with survivors by forming genuine and healthy relationships, acknowledging that head trauma, so this is where we come in, but acknowledging that head trauma and mental health challenges are common, and then providing information and education to survivors, identifying short and long-term physical, cognitive, and emotional consequences of that head trauma and of strangulation, responding by accommodating the needs related to traumatic brain injury, strangulation, and mental health challenges, to make sure that services were accessible, and providing effective, accessible referrals and advocacy for individuals that needed additional care. And then having advocates evaluate those accommodations and referrals and touch base regularly to see if the adjustments actually made sense for survivors. So really the focus of care is on accommodation and making sure that services are accessible to survivors given the head trauma that many of the survivors have experienced. And if you think about the services survivors, I mean, all of the activities that survivors oftentimes need to engage in as they're accessing services, many of these are life-saving services and life-preserving things that they need to do. And so the focus of the care tools and the care itself is really on making sure that these kind of services are accessible to survivors. So the care tools themselves, these are the care tools, and they're all accessible and free for download at the Ohio Domestic Violence website. The head injury card is pictured here. We've now translated things into multiple languages. This is shown in English and Spanish, but the head injury card talks about traumatic brain injury and strangulation. It talks about head injury and strangulation, physical, cognitive, and emotional symptoms and next steps, as well as danger signs in terms of when you might need to seek immediate medical care. The Just Breathe booklet was designed to promote mental wellness and mental health, and it addresses coping strategies. There's a self-care plan in there and tips for motion and relaxation. And then the Invisible Injuries booklet really provides some brain injury basic information. It goes over problems and strategies, symptom logs, safety planning, and goals. And we handed over this framework and all of these tools to the 5 partner programs around the state that really helped us develop this. And then they implemented care and advocacy practice. And advocacy practice looks very different in all these different places. So in order to understand how advocates were using care, we then went back out and we did process evaluation to understand how they were using care, and outcome evaluation to understand if care was effective. And so what we found really quickly in terms of the outcome evaluation was actually care was effective in improving trauma-informed advocacy practices. We are trying to put this under review elsewhere, but basically overall, in terms of agency trauma-informed practices, as well as being much more flexible with survivors on specific issues as well, advocates were providing increased care around a variety of things. And then the process evaluation really helped us understand why this was and how care was working. And we discovered that care was working by increasing advocates' awareness and knowledge of brain injury itself, which then increased the structural and functional social supports that advocates were providing to survivors. And what's presented in the Journal of Head Trauma and Rehabilitation is really our understanding of how the care tools are being used to address brain injury and mental health struggles with survivors of domestic violence. So our methods really for the process evaluation, we do present a little bit from the process online surveys that we did, the retrospective process evaluation online surveys that we did with staff members. We interviewed 60 staff members online. And then we also went out to the agencies and did focus groups, 10 focus groups at each of the 5 agencies with 57 advocates total. Those focus groups were professionally transcribed, and we went through 2 stages of different kinds of analysis. The first analysis, we applied structural codes to the text, and there were 2 members of the research team that read the transcripts separately and applied structural codes. And then we did in-depth codes. We created in-depth codes using emergent themes from the structurally coded text answer process evaluation and applied those codes again. And we had acceptable inter-rater reliability both times we went through the process. And really to minimize bias, ODVN staff, though they were trained, I always train my community partners in the research process and put them on my research protocols. They were not present at any of the focus groups to try to reduce bias. What we found is that there's a high turnover at domestic violence service organizations. So not all staff members that completed our outcome or our process evaluation were trained in the use of CARE tools, but more of our staff were actually using the CARE tools than were trained in them. But we actually found through the process evaluation that the tools were simple enough that the staff members were telling us they just had to pick up the tools and read them. And they were really designed directly to be used by advocates. So in terms of what we learned about the CARE tools, we learned that the CARE tools are really integral to the implementation of CARE. So the tools are being used to connect with the self. So advocates are using them to connect to themselves, with survivors, and with other systems of care. And they're being used to acknowledge that not only are head trauma and mental health struggles common among survivors, but that ongoing education and self-care are necessary for advocates. And really through this acknowledgement, advocates have been able to provide a more holistic response for accommodation within domestic violence service organizations and referral to other systems of response and care. And this often directly through the use of the CARE tools. So in terms of how advocates are directly impacted by the CARE tools, they are using them as brain injury self-education guides. They're using them to acknowledge that secondary trauma among staff at domestic violence service organization is common. So they're actually using these tools to prevent staff burnout. They are using these tools for staff members. And they're also using these tools to integrate knowledge about brain injury, mental health, and substance use and trauma, thereby allowing providers to respond more holistically and offer accommodations and retain survivors in services. In terms of how advocates are using the CARE tools with DV survivors, they're using these survivors. Here you can see this is the CARE framework. They're using them to connect with survivors regarding mental health and brain injury, to acknowledge that brain injury and mental health struggles are common among DV survivors, and thereby normalizing survivors' experiences, validating survivors' feelings, and helping survivors feel less alone. And they're responding to help survivors with executive function dysregulation, organization, and task of daily living. And then they also advocates spoke about how CARE tools have been used beyond the domestic violence service organizations. So they're using the head injury card in particular this is being used by criminal justice and health professionals and other service systems to connect. Advocates were telling us that the criminal justice and health professionals that they're working with were calling the domestic violence service organization, asking for these tools to be placed in their service system. The tools were really empowering survivors to advocate for their own needs when advocates weren't present. So, survivors were taking these into courts, for instance, and using the words directly off of these tools when speaking to judges and when entering statements into court. And then the head injury education cards facilitated healthcare's ability to respond to brain injury from DV. Survivors were taking these cards in, circling the symptoms they had. And we even had advocates tell us that healthcare professionals called the domestic violence organizations back saying, I never would have screened for brain injury had the survivor not brought this card in with these symptoms circled. So these cards are being used in that respect too. So for us, before CARE and these CARE tools, few tools that we are aware of were available to educate DV survivors and facilitate dialogue between advocates and survivors about brain injury and mental health. We do know there's limitations. This was developed in advocacy practice for use in advocacy practice. It's all lay terms that are used on these cards because that's what survivors and advocates told us they wanted. It is a limited sample. But these were designed for lay use. They're free for download. They're accessible. At this point, I know they're effective. And so, we do believe that the more widespread use of these tools by advocates has the potential to improve services for DV survivors and to address what has historically been invisible injuries and mental health struggles in the population. And I did want to quickly mention there is an additional tool. We haven't done as much testing on it, but we are starting to do some testing. This is the CHATS tool. It is part of the CARE project, but it came pretty late. And this asks some more directive questions. It's for advocates to use around assessing for choking, hits to the head, altered consciousness, troubles that advocates or survivors are having, and if survivors want to be seen for those things. So this is how you can get a hold of me. And then Rachel Ramirez is my community-based partner that does a lot of this work as well. Thank you.
That was awesome. Thank you so much, Julianna.
I'm texting with Rachel from Myrtle Beach on vacation, and she said, great job and hello to everyone.
Thanks.
It is a true community academic relationship that those two have. It's really awesome. And we should have more of those. It's an excellent model. So I'm looking at the time. I don't know if we have time for one question. I saw that it was great that questions were being asked in the chat and answered. So that's awesome. But if anyone has one question for Julianna, we can probably take one before it turns 3 o'clock. Wow. Oh, I'd like Katherine's raising her hand.
I also wanted to know what other languages are available now. I'm so excited.
I wish I could tell you more than Spanish and English, but Spanish and English for sure. For sure. We need more money to be able to translate into more languages. So if anyone has a handle on money, that's the key to translation. But if we can translate, we will put it up for free on the ODVN website because we're all about distributing for free.
Thank you. So we are out of time. It looks like we ended perfectly on time. That's just who we are. Thank you so much, Dr. Saadi, Dr. Daugherty, Dr. Nemeth. I don't even like calling you doctors because you're my friends. And I just like saying your first names, but you are all wonderful. I'm so proud of you. I know, Julianna, I have nothing to do with your success, but I'm still proud of you. It's truly a pleasure. It's really a pleasure to work with all of you. You make me smile, you make my heart sing, and it's so great to have wonderful colleagues in the field. So thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.